Hey folks, welcome back to Office Hours. I am back from my recent travels, one of which was to DevNexus conference up in Atlanta, Java conference I'd mentioned before, and then after that, actually went on a cruise with some friends, living the hard life, as they say. It was a pretty good time. We went to did actually go to the Bahamas, went out of Port Canaveral to Bahamas and then back. Just a quick little trip. We stopped at not a private island. That sounds very fancy. It was definitely not super fancy. One of those little like corporate islands, and spend some time on the beach and whatnot as well. So it's definitely nice to go on a trip where the weather was actually better than where I live. I can't say that about Atlanta. It was fine and all. A little bit chilly for me, but it was good. So the Atlanta conference, DevNexus, I don't know the numbers. It was definitely over 1,000 people. Very well put on. Production was really nice. They do a really nice job of putting a conference together. Certainly, if you're into Java, I don't see why you would not go to that conference. And if you're just into tech in general and don't mind Java people, I guess I might suggest that as well. Especially if you're in the Southeast. I feel like when I lived in Florida before, I've probably been. So this is like my second conference up in Atlanta, and I don't know that I ever went to a conference in Atlanta before, 20 years back or whatever when I was living in Florida before. So I don't know if that's like a new thing. I assume they did have some then, but maybe not so much because I think Atlanta has grown as much more of a tech hub than it was 20 years ago. So it could certainly have some aspect to it. But in any case, had a Java conference. I have my Java of choice here this morning as well. And like I said, it was definitely a good time. Had a lot of people come to the booth. First sort of main interaction, I think, for many people with Postgres. And actually, what I was going to do today, I thought I would. It's not so much a recap, but I thought I would answer the questions that I thought I got the most frequently. These might be biased. Like one of the folks who was there working. So I was at a U.S. Postgres Association community booth. One of the folks who was there with me was Dave Kramer from Amazon. If you don't know him, he's the sort of lead maintainer of the JDBC project and works on ODBC as well. I think he's been harangued into that a little bit. So I got to spend some time with him, and he's got some pretty interesting ideas actually on doing like sort of incorporating Java libraries into Postgres. I wouldn't say it's like a reimagining of PL Java, but if you've ever looked at like PL Java or PLJ back in the day, some new ideas around how to implement that stuff if you're into that kind of thing. So we'll see what comes out of. He was researching that a little bit also at the conference. So it'll be interesting to see if he actually can get that all pulled together for folks. So, but in any case, so maybe more hardcore Java questions went to him. I'm not entirely sure. I don't think so. One of the things that we noticed, a lot of folks are not really like they're Java developers and they're programming with Java on a daily basis. They're not super used to or like cognizant of like, hey, there's a JDBC driver. It's like, yeah, we know that it's there, but we don't really pay attention because we use like Hibernate or some other sort of abstraction thing on top of it anyway. So they don't have to deal with that. And part of that, like, you might think like, well, that's sort of unfortunate. And I mean, you'd like people to understand, the components to get from like app code back to the database and the hops in between. I think that, as you progress to being a senior developer, somewhere on that path, you're going to learn that stuff and get more familiar with it. On the other hand, if you are a driver maintainer, it's one of those weird dichotomies of like, realistically, if your stuff is working, then people don't really have to know about it, right? It is similar to, I'm sure many DBAs out there have had that sort of thing. Like if your database doesn't have problems, then people don't really learn a lot about it. So in this case, JDBC, it's a very mature project, been around for, I don't know, 20 plus years or whatever, longer than that, I'm sure, actually. So, it works pretty smoothly, and I think people don't have a lot of problems with it. So they don't really know much about it. And again, that's, potentially a good thing. So in any case, so we got some questions. I thought I would just kind of run through those questions. So you have an idea of like what were people asking at the booth? Maybe if you're new to Postgres, these I think will be useful to you. I assume that the bias is somewhat like people who are less familiar with Postgres or have a particular niche about it. So that they've gone into one part of sort of understanding it. And those are the ones that come to the booth. Because again, this was the first Postgres booth that has been at this conference. So there have been Postgres talks, and I would imagine maybe some Postgres companies have maybe done booths there before. Not 100% sure of that, but this is sort of the first community booth, so as will be evidence of some of the questions. So I'll run you through some of those, and then we'll kind of go from there. So I guess I might as well just jump into that, and then I'll let you know a little more about what was going on there. Again, like I think it was really nicely done. I really did like it. I do hope that we return to that conference. I think as a community, Postgres should be reaching out to those folks as well. So. And so the first question that I was going to talk about, question number one is some version of, and we got this by far and away. I think this is the most common question that we got, or some version of this question, which was sort of the like, are you employed by Postgres? What do you do for Postgres as a job / is Postgres hiring? Right. So some sort of version of that implied like, we don't actually understand how Postgres works. And I would forgive people for not really understanding that if you think, the vast majority of sort of large scale enterprise software that is in the open source realm are open source projects, right? They're not, or they are open source products. They're not open source projects like Postgres. So I do understand why people get confused. And even like, I don't know if it was like a joke or whatever, inside joke or whatever of the organizers. It's kind of funny. So we had our Postgres community booth, and then right next to us was a MySQL booth that was run by somebody from Oracle. There was actually also an Oracle booth, so that was a little bit weird too. So yeah, sorry, Oracle. Yeah, gets you every time. No, the MySQL guys were really nice. Talked to a few of them, and I definitely don't mind a good Oracle is the evil empire joke. But what I find, like the commonalities, if you are in the job of running Oracle databases or in the job of running Postgres or MySQL or SQL Server or like any of those, right? Like the job, certain traits and patterns emerge regardless of what the software is, right? Of what the job is. So it's pretty easy to swap war stories with those guys and have a pretty good time, which I think we did. So that was fun, but it's also a little bit ironic that they put the Postgres booth right next to the MySQL booth. And in this case, it sort of highlights, right? So MySQL booth is run by Oracle employees, and here we had folks from like Crunchy and Amazon and myself also there at the Postgres booth. So just a little bit of a different mixture and how it goes. So on those questions, when people would ask that, it's like, what do you do? Or how do I get a job at Postgres? Or whatever version of that question they ask. So then we go and explain like, well, actually, we're here from the U.S. Postgres Association. It's one of the nonprofits that primarily focuses on community outreach and advocacy, to explain to people how the Postgres project works and how the community around it works. There's no single owner of Postgres, right? We go into those kind of things. And usually the analogy to me is that I'll give folks is, think of like the Linux kernel. If you say like, well, who owns the Linux kernel? There's no company that has like complete ownership of that. You have a bunch of companies who all contribute into it, and then there's this sort of open source upstream, and then people go and do with it what they will. So you have a lot of companies sort of supporting it. And Postgres works very similar to that, right? All the big cloud vendors support it. There's a lot of Postgres specific companies that support it as well, and you can get independent contributors and that kind of stuff as well. So as well as a wide user base in pretty much every industry that's out there, e-commerce, banking, stonks, whatever, like it's all there. Even Bitcoiners, stores, like people that are working on blockchain solutions that use Postgres to store their stuff. Like I understand why you do that. There's certain irony I find a lot of things funny and ironic in this world, but anyway, so we like to explain that the sort of difference between like Postgres and we don't work for Postgres. We contribute back to Postgres, and if you want to get involved in the U.S. Postgres Association, postgresql.us, and often if they're certainly an interested person, we'll try to bring up the idea of if you want to start a meetup in your city, talk to U.S. Postgres Association. They will definitely help you with that. So that's kind of the general message there, and explaining the difference of just community and project and whatnot. So for some people, I think that's really, throws them for a loop. Other people, like, they totally get it, and that's pretty nice, so but that was by and large, I think, the main question. And if I contrast this, like, what's interesting is, if you think of something like All Things Open or Scale, which are two other conferences I really do like to go to. All Things Open is in Raleigh, North Carolina. and Scale is in Los Angeles, out in California. So those are like, I would say, larger conferences, but they also speak to like definitely a wider audience and one that is not even as tech focused. I think All Things Open probably more tech focused than Scale on some level, but certainly like there are folks that we see at Scale that are just like, hey, I'm in college and I'm thinking of getting into tech, and I'm just curious what you do. With All Things Open, I think people have a better understanding. Maybe it's just like they do a really nice job, and there's other events that the All Things Open team runs around what open source is, and they do meetups and that kind of stuff. So maybe just the people who are coming to All Things Open are like they get a pre-education before they arrive. But in those cases, like, so some of those people, you're really hitting them pretty early in their career, and you see this in other things where if you're close enough to like a university or something, and again, like I think it's important you want to at least like have a touch point with developers early in their career, whether they're even developers yet or not. They don't know which way they're going to go. Let them know, hey, there's this thing. It's called Postgres. That may not be what your university is pushing on you for classes. Some universities do, but other ones, like they sign a big agreement with some company, and the company says use our proprietary database. So we want them to understand that there is a feature-rich, mature, open source database project out there that they can get involved with, and even have a career with. So we like to do that at DevNexus. The bar is like, I mean, I didn't run into anyone. There might have been a few college students, but they all had, it seemed like they had all had internships and had written software. Most everybody there seemed like, yeah, my day to day is, the entry level is like, I'm a Java developer and I've been doing that for a few years now. That seemed to be like the kind of lowest bar that we were hitting. And then it's more senior developers on it from there, and architects and whatever, right? Like that get involved in stuff. But it was definitely, I think, a higher technical bar to get in there. So a smaller conference, but I think probably even a better target for who you'd probably want to think you'd want to talk to about Postgres. So anyway, so yeah, so we explained all that, and that was good. And that, again, anytime you're doing, I think, developer outreach, and you're a database product, and certainly even Postgres, when we think of it in the Postgres community, like, oh, everybody knows what Postgres is, but a lot of people develop software and don't actually deal with a database on a regular basis. And like, you're like, how do you not have a database or something? But it's like, well, if you're doing like video game software or something like that, you're probably not actually doing that. Or the type of database you're doing is like a file database, embedded database, or something like that. So maybe they've touched SQLite, and you can kind of explain it's like SQLite, but like bigger and whatever. So, okay. Anyways, enough on that one. Hopefully everybody gets that, and we've done a decent job of explaining how it works in the Postgres world. So. The second one, I think, kind of follows on from that, although these are probably people coming from a different angle. And there were basically two versions of this that we got. And it was like, what is the hardest part? Are there any gotchas? What should I be looking for? As my company is now migrating from Oracle to Postgres or SQL Server to Postgres. And those were definitely the two that we got. I don't know, it could be because, there's some MySQL booth. There are a couple people who are like, I used to use MySQL, now I use Postgres. I don't want to say that super loud because the MySQL guy's right there. So and also there was one or two that were the other way around. So, maybe there's we didn't hear that about MySQL because the MySQL stuff was, they're sitting right there. So, in any case, so most of it, I think, was Oracle, and then SQL Server probably was the number two. And then I think just generic, maybe there were some NoSQL ones, but there's, a bunch of people, that's their introduction to Postgres. I've often said, like, for many people, I guess this has probably changed in the last 5 years, but I know if you went back like 10 years and before, nobody's first database was ever Postgres. They always started with something else, and then, they end up like, oh, my company migrates, or I stumbled across, or whatever it is, and then they learn Postgres, and they're like, oh, this is, really cool. So there was that, and I think as the sort of most high-level generic answer that I would give, if you say like coming from Oracle or SQL Server, those two specifically, what is the hardest part? To me, I think it's one of two things for most people, and the first one is store procedures / functions, right? If you have a large like a large code base in like PLSQL or TSQL functions, and you make heavy use of that, there's not a really great way to kind of automate that process of converting those all into Postgres. And the other part of that, which is just like the developer tooling around, like, not, I mean, it's not good in Postgres, but it's not good uh, in Oracle or SQL Server either, in the sense that, like, if you think about somebody doing like test driven development for like Ruby code, right? Or they're gonna use, the tap framework in like Java or Perl or something like that. Like there's stuff for like mature development processes, and that stuff really, it's just, even if the tools exist, like they just don't get used for like stored procedure code and stuff like that. So to find an Oracle database that makes extensive use of PLSQL and custom stored procedures, who also has a good testing framework, right? That you could actually say, all right, we're going to convert this, and we'll even do an automated thing, because PLSQL. I mean, I think PLSQL to PGSQL is an easier leap to make than like T-SQL to PLPGSQL, and you can do some automation of that. There are some tools out there that do automation of that, but it's like, well, then how do you know that they actually did everything correctly, right? And like, where's the test suite for all your PLSQL code? Most shops don't really seem to have that, right? They don't. So when you try to do these big migrations, it's really tough. So if that's going to be part of your journey, and again, like, I used to sell these migration services. So if that's part of the journey, like, that makes it just much more difficult and much more expensive, and doesn't mean you shouldn't do it or that you can't do it. Just like, I think that's going to be the hardest part, number one. Now, not everybody does that, and a lot of people, that's not going to be their issue. So that's cool. If you're not using that, then usually the second thing for most people is actually a GUI to manage the database or interact with it in some way. If you look at, for all and this is actually, it's a thing I think it's not greatly understood within the Postgres community, but the value add of the interface to Postgres. Like, I mean, I use pSQL, right? Like, that's what I use. I'm a PSQL guy. Like, I have custom PSQL RCs and all that stuff. So I understand like that piece of it, and that's what I use, and that's what I would actually tell. If you're going to have a career in Postgres, get used to PSQL. That's what I would tell people. But for most people, like, there's a value add of Oracle Enterprise Manager or SQL Server Management Studio, right? And that's one of the reasons, if you go use something like RDS from Amazon, like the web interface that they give you and the management tools that are built into that, it is a significant value add for most people. And it makes it, worlds easier, I think, for a lot of people to actually get in and use these databases like Postgres. So there is a big value add in those GUIs, and what we have in the Postgres community, in my opinion, just doesn't measure up. I just mentioned to somebody on Twitter, I think it was yesterday, like, I usually tell people, check out dbeaver. I think it's pretty decent. But there's not like a GUI that, like, if you're looking for Oracle Enterprise Manager or SQL Server Management Studio in Postgres, like, those things don't exist. And if that's what you've been working on, Oracle for 10 years, SQL Server for 10 years, and that's the tooling you want, like that, you're just going to have to get over the fact that you're not going to find anything, that good. Now, if you go from Oracle to SQL Server, I think you have the same issue, that you want Oracle Enterprise Manager and you get SQL Server Management Studio. And those aren't, like, it's not like those two are both great and similar. There are definitely differences between those two tools as well. So I think what people like about one or the other, you'd have that same pain if you're swapping between those two. But in my opinion, I think they're both, I understand why people definitely like those better than what they find for GUIs that are available in Postgres. So, that's probably the number two thing to me, is that people stumble on. It's like, how do I, what's the deal with the GUIs, and how do I get access to that? So that was number two. I think the third question that we got, I got a few of these. There were, again, it's sort of some version of how do I upgrade with no downtime? And I think in a lot of cases, like, we typically will ask, like, so what version of Postgres are you running? To see, we kind of would like to know, do people know? They don't always know, it's fine. Again, like, if you're, depending on how your development shop works, or you can be like, well, we run it against Postgres and we do whatever our local development is, we throw the code over the wall, there's a test harness, and they figure it out in production, right? A lot of shops work that way. So that's what you're doing. You may not necessarily know But they might be on an older version, and then the thing that is a blocker is like, how do I do this without downtime? Uh, Nowadays, I think the answer to me is like, well, first off, you should try to figure out how you can get at least some kind of downtime window. You can then use something, like PG upgrade to do the upgrade process, and it's a very short downtime window, even if you have a pretty large database. Data size is not really the big issue there. It's number of objects in the database. It'd be more of an issue. So that's sort of the first thing. And then the second one is like, you can always point them, like, you can do it with logical replication. Again, like the complexity or difficulty of that really depends on the schema of your database and, how sensitive you are to latency and stuff like that when it comes to the no downtime requirements. So there are definitely ways to do that now. Now, I would generally say, I'm going to assume you're on Postgres 10 or newer. I mean, it's been EOL, I think, for 2 years now, so hopefully you are there. But there are definitely a lot of people stuck on that 9.6, and you can go try to use something like PG Logical to do that. I've had sort of mixed results with that versus the built-in stuff, but there are definitely options there. And neither of those, like, I'd like that to be a smoother process for folks, and I think folks would like that to be a smoother process, but that stuff, it takes time. It takes time. So that was kind of the third question, was like upgrades and no downtime, and how's that process work? And so we just kind of would walk them through that and then kind of point them, like I said, usually a logical replication if you want to do it with no downtime across major versions. So the fourth one that we got, I was actually a little bit surprised that this came up a few times. And it was basically like, do you have any tips on debugging lock issues in Postgres? And I don't know. So I think developers do the wrong thing when it comes to trying to manually manage locks, both in Oracle and SQL Server. In my experience, it's actually worse in SQL Server because SQL Server lets you do things like, take a lot like locks with no wait or read uncommitted data and stuff like that. So people are like, I'm pretty sure I can implement, a build your own lock manager in my application code that's way better than what the database could do, and there won't be any issues with that. And okay, sure. So I think people maybe then try to re-implement that in Postgres, and so then they run into issues because those issues are complicated and really probably. I mean, I go talk to anyone who's a SQL Server expert. I'm not going to say that I am. If you go talk to one, and I think they will also tell you, like, you should try to avoid doing things like no lock and read uncommitted and stuff like that. That's dragons lie there. And even though, like, I see, like, we're implementing more of that stuff in Postgres because people are coming from these other communities, and they're like, oh, I got to be able to do that. It's like, oh man, okay, well, somebody wrote a check. I guess we're going to have that feature. It's a really bad idea. In any case, so I think that, so the two, like, sort of really quick ones, because it's really difficult to have a sort of deep technical discussion about debugging lock issues with somebody at a conference. Like, you really kind of need to sit down with them and kind of look at various information that you kind of pull out of the database and whatnot. So the two things I think we usually try to make sure people are aware of. The first one is make sure you have lock weights turned on. There are some parameters around locks and debugging and whatnot, and so you definitely want that to be on, so that if you are having issues around locks and waiting on locks and that kind of a thing, that you'll actually see that in your log and you can kind of get that information to come forward. There are actually wait events for this as well. It's not quite, there's some tooling out there. I don't know of any great, like, sort of open source real-time thing that you could look to figure that out, other than just like go query the system tables. And that's sort of tip number 2, which is make sure you're looking at like PG locks. And you can build some interesting views across like PG locks and PG stat activity to figure out like what's blocking what and what. You Google like Postgres, what's blocking my query, like you'll find some queries that do that type of activity. So that's worth looking at as well, because those are kind of like the two issues. And sort of the third one that I do mention to people sometimes is that sometimes people think they have some kind of lock issue, which are locks at sort of the SQL level or application level, and what their issues really are if they're doing things like large transactions or prepared transactions where there's going to be a bunch of work gets done, and then when they hit commit, like a bunch of stuff has to actually get flushed to this, and triggers have to be looked at, especially if they have foreign keys, which are delayed checks. So then the foreign keys get checked sort of at the end of the transaction. That kind of stuff can lead to things that look like locks and lock waiting, and it kind of is because if you're checking foreign keys, um, the thing is that they're held longer than they would normally be because like a deferred foreign key, right? It's done at the end, and you might think like, well, this allows me to do some magic during the transaction. If you don't need that magic, it may be better off to not use deferred foreign keys so that the locks are checked like immediately, uh, and it kind of spreads out like when the locks are taken and all that. And I've seen that result in deadlock issues like when you're using deferred foreign keys and like multi-step transactions. So that is another thing. Like if just look for that pattern, and if you do that, then you may want to try to investigate in there. So that's another sort of third tip when you're trying to debug lock issues. But main thing is you kind of got to force to get some information out of the system, and lock weights is probably the first place to look at that, and then PG locks and PG stat activity and wait events would be the sort of thing. Start digging around in there. Again, depending on your version, how much you can get out of that information. So that's number 3. Number 4, actually no, that was number 4. Math is hard. That's number 4. So final question then. This is another one I thought was kind of odd. I feel like this is because, so none of these, I don't know, none of those I felt, maybe the lock one is like, are these like Java specific questions? Because you're kind of like, well, you go to a Java conference, are you going to get wildly different questions than what you get at like a Ruby conference or a PHP conference or whatever? The lock one, it was just sort of odd. It felt like a lot of those people were migrating from other databases into Postgres and then running into this issue. So that's why I wonder if there's stuff around lock weights and whatnot. For the last question, so we had a few folks that asked different questions around things like connection limits. And again, like that's a little bit of an odd question. And what I think it stems from, and I'm just kind of extrapolating this from sort of past experience with other languages really, is that in Java, a lot of people try to kind of roll their own application level connection pooling. And I don't even know, roll your own is probably not even the right way to put that. You're just using an application side Java connection pooler as opposed to something that is, I guess more DB side, thinking specifically of like PG Bouncer. And so we have the connection around that. Usually the first question is like, hey, have you increased max connections? Because it's probably okay to do that. Don't go crazy. But if you're still running at the default of 100 and you've got some reserve for super users, maybe, and especially if you're doing like parallel workers or something, like you might need to look into like all your connection parameters and just see what's going on there. And in a lot of cases, certainly like larger enterprises and whatnot, you can bump that stuff up. But then the second thing is like, have you looked at PG Bouncer? Do you know about it? And there's some other poolers out there in the Postgres community that are also worth taking a look at. But implementing more of a database side connection pooler or something that is sort of more generic and accepted within the database community, as opposed to like the pooler that's built into your application framework, right? Like that, I think is usually a good idea. In most cases, I've seen that, and this is across multiple languages, so I've seen that implemented in a lot of things. Certainly, we did that a lot. Like Perl DBI, I remember like back in the day, we were like the coolest feature of Perl DBI was like it did connection pooling. This was like sort of pre-PG Bouncer, and then once PG Bouncer hit the scene, it's like, oh, now we have like a really robust connection pooler that we can run, as a service on the database side for the database folks. And so then we're like, turn off the DBI stuff. Like it causes more problems than it solves. So we got rid of that. So that's usually look at your max connections and that kind of thing. Are you doing connections reserved per user? That's another pattern that like if you're, it's one of those like when you do things the right way, then like they become more complicated and difficult. So like if every one of your users has its own role, right? So you do roles at the application level, which I would say is probably a good idea. Then you can also set max connections on those specific roles, so that application, like an application that goes run amok on your database, doesn't like suck down all the connections. Definitely have seen that problem many a time in many a different language. So that's one thing to go look at. Like you may want to also set max connections at the role level to stop other apps who are doing the wrong thing from sort of connection starvation in that case. So just another kind of tip there. So that was the fifth one. Again, hopefully those are kind of useful. Maybe you find those interesting. If you're running into problems like that, let me know. Happy to dive into more on that. There's definitely good resources around that stuff. So I think that'll do it. Like I've definitely rambled a bit too much somewhere in this, already over the 30-minute mark. So I will let everybody go. No real bits and bobs to speak of. Working on my schedule for the fall. Hoping I think the two that are really on my radar as far as events that I might hit are maybe actually PGCon, whatever the European one is called now. I get it mixed up. So the European Postgres is in Greece, and I have a long-standing desire to go visit some people in Greece. So I might actually go to that. And then the past Data Summit in Seattle later in the year, sort of the other one I think is on my radar. But we'll see how conference submissions go and all that stuff. Other than that, nothing immediately on the radar. There are some things coming up. Um, Microsoft is doing Posette. I'll just mention that because I will probably go to that if that's what you want to call it. It's a virtual conference, and I do plan on attending it in some fashion. So, other than that, I will be back for another office hours, and we'll keep doing that. And if you have questions, feel free to send them to me one way or the other. I will collate them and put them into an office hours. And I think that's it for now. Till next time, take care of yourself, and if you can, take care of your database as well. See ya.